Born from a legend? The name Andre the Giant is known to millions. He wasn't just a wrestler, he was a man who changed the perception of physical possibilities. His height, his mass, his charisma, all of this made him a living myth. But few people know that this giant left behind a daughter. Her birth was an event that even wrestling fans didn't know about for a long time. Her mother, a woman named Jean Christiansen, was not a star, did not walk red carpets, and did not seek fame. That is why the birth of their daughter happened in the shadows, almost in secret. At the time of the girl's birth, Andre was living a double life. In the ring, he was a monster, but outside of it, he was a man hiding his suffering. He rarely appeared at home and hardly ever spoke about his personal life. For him, the stage was home, and home was something temporary. He was constantly on the road, and when he was around, his relationship with Jean was strained. A girl was born, an unusual one. Even the doctors immediately noticed. This was not an ordinary child. Even as an infant, she stood out. She was bigger than her peers, with very broad shoulders, massive hands, and dense bones. Medical examinations showed this was no coincidence, it was genetics. The very same genes that made Andre the greatest giant in sports history. There were no news articles about her birth, no headlines, no photographs. To the world, she did not exist. And yet she was a direct descendant of a legend. And this silence, yes, was only the beginning of a long and tangled story. But what is it like to inherit everything from the strongest person on the planet? She inherited it all. From an early age, it became clear. Andre's daughter was not just a child. It was as if a power of another scale resided within her body. By the age of 3, she looked like a 5-year-old. By 7, like a teenager. Teachers at school said she scared the other children. Students said that next to her they felt small, and doctors said that her body was developing according to laws not quite typical for ordinary people. Studies showed that she had thickened bones, increased muscle mass, and an unusual joint structure. The strength of her arms was several times greater than that of her peers. This was not the result of training or sports. It was genetics, real strong heavy genes. And while adults found this interesting, for the girl herself it felt more like a punishment. She couldn't buy regular shoes. Her clothes had to be custom-made. Every visit to the hospital turned into a medical sensation. She was an object of interest, not just a person. Sometimes she cried because she couldn't play with others, because in the mirror she didn't see herself, but a face in which people recognized someone else. "You're just like your father," they told her. And it wasn't a compliment. But her story was only just beginning. And there was one thing missing in the girl's life, the very Andrea himself. Why was he present only on paper? A ghost of a father. She simply called him that man because to her he was never a dad. He didn't read her bedtime stories, didn't come to school events, didn't teach her how to ride a bike. All she had from him were photographs and the occasional phone call. Very occasional. Andrea lived like a legend, but legends have no time for everyday family life. He would come when his schedule allowed, sometimes for a day, sometimes just for a few hours, and then disappear again. Back in his suit, back in the arena. And every time he left, she cried. Far too grown up for her age, but still just a girl. His health was deteriorating and life was speeding up. By the time she turned 10, he hardly ever showed up anymore. He tried to shield her from attention, so he never officially acknowledged her as his daughter. It was his decision to keep her in the shadows so she could live a normal life, or so he said. But life in the shadow of a giant is never normal. When Andrea passed away, she was only 12. She never got to say goodbye, didn't even know he was ill, and with him went the chance to ever hear him say, "I'm proud of you." And even after his death, he left her not only his looks but also questions he never answered. Life in the shadow of a titan. Every day for her began with a reflection. A face seemingly cut out from old wrestling posters. The same forehead, the same eyes, that same incredible jaw. People on the street would turn to look, some would stop, some would get scared. Some even asked for an autograph. And every time she had to explain, she was not him. But how can you explain that when you're his spitting image? She was teased at school. Kids can be cruel. Giant's daughter, Mammoth, Man in a Skirt. And those were just the mild nicknames. The teachers tried to help, but what could they do? Change her face, make her shorter, erase her past. As a teenager, she tried to be normal. She lost weight, hid her hair, wore loose clothing, avoided conversations, erased any mention of her father. But the more she tried to become invisible, the more she stood out. Because you can't hide your genes, you can't undo your legacy. It will always be behind you like a giant shadow. And one day that shadow will step into the light because the world has been waiting. And finally, it has arrived. The first public appearance. It happened by accident. No one had planned a show. She just came to Andrea's memorial match, sat in the last row, put on glasses and a cap, wanting to stay unnoticed. But the cameras see everything. And when her face appeared on the screen, the arena fell silent. "Is that her?" the audience whispered. The internet exploded. The photo spread across all the sports websites. Hundreds of comments, thousands of reposts. Name: Trobin Christiansen Rusimov, age 26, appearance, a spitting image of her father. The next day, agencies were calling her, offering interviews, shows, contracts. Some even wanted her to step into the ring. Everything repeated itself, only now it was happening to her. But she wasn't seeking fame, didn't want fans, and wasn't striving to become a symbol. Her choice was different, because she knew her father's fame was not just about the spotlight, but also about loneliness. However, the world wouldn't let go, and her body was still gigantic. Strength incarnate. In everyday life, she didn't lift barbells, didn't go to the gym, didn't wrestle. And yet, anyone who happened to touch her hand could feel there was more than just muscle beneath her skin. The strength she was born with could be sensed even in her movements. She had huge hands, as if carved from stone, and fingers as strong as those of a builder. The circumference of her wrist even exceeded that of some men. And her legs were like columns, capable of bearing weight that others couldn't lift. When doctors examined her yet again, one of them said, "You have the bones of a wrestler, even if you've never stepped into the ring." It was true. Her skeleton was almost 1.5 times denser than normal, and her cartilage and joints seemed reinforced from within. Nature had made her the heir of a giant, without any extra effort. This strength did not bring her joy. She felt no pride in it. On the contrary, she tried not to touch fragile things. She was afraid of hugging someone too tightly. She was afraid of being too big. And most often, she was afraid that people would look at her like an exhibit. But the strength was with her every minute, even when she tried to be weak. What does a person do when they realize their body doesn't fit into the ordinary world? The giant complex. Sometimes she would stand in front of the mirror for an hour, looking, staying silent, and still couldn't accept her reflection. She was about 6.5 feet tall, and sometimes it felt like a full 8. Her shoulders were wider than doorways. Shoes are for men only. She didn't even look at high heels. As a teenager, she hated her body, tried dieting, hid under oversized clothes, and avoided photos. And when she did appear in group photos, she always tried to be somewhere in the back, hunched over, inconspicuous, because next to others, she felt less like a person and more like a boulder. Psychologists talked about things like dysmorphophobia, the fear of one's own body, but she felt something different. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling that she was living in her father's body and couldn't separate herself from it in any way. Sometimes she wanted to be someone else, dreamed of being born ordinary, or at least a couple of inches shorter, just so she wouldn't stand out, so she could walk down the street without hearing behind her, "Wow, did you see that?" But inside, everything was boiling because she knew the more she hid, the less she became herself. And one day, she would decide to break it all off forever. Turning her back on the stage. There were plenty of offers. Contracts to appear on shows, documentary films. Even wrestling schools invited her. "You'll be the next legend." Some even suggested she play her father in retrospective scenes, but she turned everything down. Public attention frightened her. Cameras paralyzed her. Inside, she didn't have a drop of desire to continue the family business. She wanted to live her own life, without flashes, without costumes, without an audience. Many said she missed her chance, that she could have made millions. But for her, it wasn't an opportunity. It was a trap. She was afraid of losing herself completely, because every public appearance turned her not into a person, but into Andrea's daughter. And one day, she said firmly, "I will not be a star. Not for money, not for fame, not for legacy." Simply because she wanted to remain herself, a person, not a title. But even after choosing silence, she couldn't escape the consequences, because her father's name followed her like an echo. Difficulties in her personal life. When she fell in love, it seemed to her that finally things were normal, that love didn't see height or measure the width of shoulders. But reality was harsh. Guys felt uncomfortable around her. Some made jokes, some avoided touching her, and some said to her face, "You're too masculine." At first, she tried to change for others, becoming quieter, more feminine, wearing skirts even if they didn't suit her, changing the way she walked. But all of it felt like a performance. She grew tired because the more she tried to be convenient for others, the more she lost herself. Sometimes people would write to her on social media. Some people genuinely admired her, some asked for advice, while others openly mocked her, calling her a monster or, on the contrary, fetishizing her as something exotic. It hurt her deeply. One day, she truly fell in love and for the first time, felt accepted. But then she found out that this person was just using her name. PR, photos, interviews. The tears lasted a long time, and after that, she withdrew into herself. But the past wouldn't let go, especially the part that concerned her mother. And one day, it was her mother who brought a storm back into her life. Her mother's revenge. After Andrea's death, Jean, the girl's mother, was left empty-handed. Legally, he had not acknowledged his daughter. There were few documents, and even fewer words. And the property was divided among those who happened to be in the right place at the right time. But Jean didn't give up. She went to court, demanding recognition, a share of the inheritance, and for her daughter to be named as the official heir. The process was long, scandalous, and torturous for the girl. The newspapers wrote about the battle for the giant's millions. The photographs she hated appeared in headlines. Her mother went public, gave interviews, and even revealed details of Andre's personal life that he definitely would not have wanted disclosed. For the daughter, this felt like a betrayal, because she wanted peace and quiet, but instead got even more noise. But at the same time, for the first time, the world heard that she officially existed, on paper, with a signature. And it was from this moment that everything began to change, because with recognition came the right to ask questions. And she had far too many of them. The giant's inheritance. After the wave of lawsuits and public acknowledgement, legal proceedings began. Documents, accounts, contracts, everything was being reopened. As it turned out, Andre's inheritance was not so fabulous after all. Although, according to rumors, he earned tens of thousands of dollars a night, most of the money went toward medical treatment, travel, and meeting his special needs. But something was left. And that something sparked a new conflict. It was not so much about the money as it was about rights. The right to his name, the right to his image, the right to future earnings from movies, toys, comics, and advertising. All of this was already generating income, and Andre's daughter, now officially recognized, was supposed to receive a share. But not everyone was happy about that. Some of the wrestlers' former partners didn't want to share. Backroom games, negotiations, and manipulations began. Some tried to win her over to their side, while others threatened her with lawsuits. But she was no longer that frightened little girl. Now she had a voice, and for the first time she said, "This isn't about money, it's about justice." She wasn't after millions. What she needed was recognition, the one thing her father never gave her in his lifetime. And although the money did come, it didn't make her happy, but it allowed her to do something she had put off for far too long. Where is she now? Instead of bustling cities, she chose the quiet of the provinces. A small house, a garden, a dog. No shows, interviews, or news reports. Just books, music, and a bit of exercise, to feel her body, not to fight against it. She was no longer afraid to look in the mirror, no longer tried to shrink herself or hide. At last, she accepted that this is who she truly is. Not an ideal, not a copy, not an heiress, just a person. The neighbors knew who she was, but they didn't make a sensation out of it. Some brought vegetables from their gardens, others invited her to dinner. People saw her as a woman, not as an image from the ring. That was a victory. A quiet one, but a real one. Sometimes journalists still wrote to her, sometimes her father's fans. She didn't reply, but she read them. And more often with a smile, because there was no more pain, only understanding. You can leave your past behind without running away from yourself. But peace can be deceptive, especially when the same genes that once put her father on a pedestal begin to interfere with the body. Hidden illnesses. My father lived a short life, less than 50 years. His heart couldn't withstand the pressure that his gigantic physique put on his body. Doctors called it acromegaly, a rare pituitary disorder in which the body doesn't stop growing. Andrea had it very clearly. In her, it was milder but still present. The first symptoms appeared quietly. Constant fatigue, joint pain, impaired vision. She attributed everything to age and stress, but one day, after fainting, she had some tests done. The results were alarming. Her body was producing too much growth hormone. This meant the internal conflict was not over. Even if everything seemed stable on the outside, there was still a storm inside. She could have sought treatment. And she did. But she understood. Her story was now following the same path as her father's. Only she knew about this in advance. This knowledge didn't frighten her. On the contrary, it made her stronger because she realized she had a chance to do what Andrea hadn't, to live consciously and use her uniqueness not as a curse but as a platform. And then came an idea that turned her world upside down. A newfound strength. She began to speak. Not on stages or on air, but in schools, colleges, and charitable organizations. She talked about acceptance, about pain, about a body that cannot be ignored, about living in the shadow of giants. People listened. Girls with rare diseases wrote her letters. Teenagers suffering from bullying said, "You helped me not to break down." Her strength was no longer just physical. It became a voice, a support, an example. She created a foundation to help children with growth disorders, became a symbol of acceptance, and for the first time felt that all of this was not in vain. All the scars, the pain, the loneliness led her to become someone others needed. Once she used to hide, now she radiated. And it was precisely then, when it seemed the circle was complete, that something unexpected happened. A person appeared who was connected to the very beginning of her story. A meeting with the past. It was an old friend of her father's, one of those who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the hall where the audience roared with excitement. He didn't find her for money, he sought her out for words, for a single phrase that Andrea had asked him to deliver. They met in a cafe. He was over 60. She barely remembered him, but he remembered her as a child. He remembered how Andrea looked at her photographs, how he silently kept the postcards she sent him, how he once said, "She is my pride, even if I don't show it." And then he handed her a letter, handwritten, with a strange date and a symbol. Inside, there was no pathos, only simple lines. "If you are reading this, it means you are grown up and I hope strong. Forgive me for not being there, but know this, you are the only part of my life I am not ashamed of." She cried, she laughed, she was silent. It was reconciliation with her father, with herself, with the past. And although her path was not easy, it was precisely that path that made her who she is, a woman who inherited not only a giant body, but also a giant heart. Father's voice. Andrea's letter was not just a message from the past for her. It was a voice, warm, honest, finally personal. He wasn't trying to justify himself, he wasn't playing a role. He wrote as a man who knew he had lost everything, but still hoped that something could be mended, if only with words. There were simple phrases about how he carried her photo in his wallet, about how he once bought a toy but never dared to give it to her, about how he was afraid he would be a bad father and so decided to disappear, thinking it would be for the best. These words mattered more than millions, more than fame. They were what she had always lacked, an acknowledgement. Not a public acknowledgement, but a human one. And for the first time in many years she was able to say, "I forgive you." With this letter, she did what had once seemed impossible. She returned to the place where it all began, to the arena where he had shone. And when she entered the empty hall, where everything seemed frozen in time, she simply closed her eyes and said aloud, "You were my father, I no longer hide it." And that phrase set something new in motion, because now she knew. She was not just a shadow, she was a continuation and could move forward. She is Andrea. She had never officially changed her last name, but now she did, Rusimov, the same as her father's. Symbolic, powerful, and no longer painful. Because now she felt not shame, but pride. The world reacted explosively. The news was full of headlines. The giant's daughter has returned. The wrestler's heiress becomes the voice of strength. But she didn't care, because she made this decision not for the public, but for herself. Now she said, "My name is Robin Rusimov." Without hesitation, without a shadow, without fear. Because now her father's name was not a label, but a part of history. Her history. She did not strive to be a hero, but she became one every time she told her truth, every time she helped others. And every time she chose the path of strength, not physical, but inner strength. And then it became clear, being Andrea is not about height, it's about choice. A new mission. She turned her popularity into a mission, not just a foundation, but a true platform for support. Educational projects, motivational speeches, online support groups, and most importantly, personal meetings. She wasn't playing a role, she wasn't a TV psychologist, she was genuine. With her rough voice, her huge hands, and her direct words that made teenagers cry because they felt she understood them, she began collaborating with medical centers. Programs for people with acromegaly, consultations, support. She became a symbol not of perfection, but of real strength. And everyone who felt different finally found a reflection of themselves. And one day she stood on stage. In front of her was a hall full of schoolchildren. She told her story, and a boy from the last row raised his hand and asked, "Are you happy?" She smiled and replied, "I became myself. That is happiness." The DNA of a legend. The scientific community did not stand aside either. Andrea's genes had always been a subject of interest, but now there was an opportunity to study them further. Robin provided samples voluntarily, without any conditions. The research revealed something astonishing. Some traits that were considered pathological had adapted in her body. What caused Andrea pain had stabilized in her. Scientists spoke about the possibility of new approaches to treating gigantism. She was not afraid of being the subject of study. On the contrary, she was proud, because she knew that her participation could change someone's life, save someone's health, or at least relieve the loneliness of someone who looks in the mirror and doesn't recognize themselves. She told the doctors, "If my cells can help someone, then it was all worth it." She did not seek fame, but became a part of science. Not as a patient, but as a key. And this became the final proof. Strength can be useful, even if it once seemed like a curse. She rewrote the ending. Andrea's story was beautiful, but tragic. He was a titan, loved by many, but killed by his own nature. His life was cut short, leaving behind only an image, sad, lonely, strong, but weary. She took up the legacy and rewrote the ending. No costumes, no battles, no triumphant entrances. Just life. Honest, difficult, real. She did not become Andrea number 2. She became what he never had the chance to be, a free person who accepted herself and gave others the chance to see that you can be great and loved and strange and needed. That was her triumph. Not in the arena, but within herself. Not in the show, but in the truth. Andrea is gone, but his story continues in her.